Bam.
All right, I'm Nathan Martin, and you're watching the Break It Down Show.
Yeah, we're waiting on Larry Sanger to come in. These things happen sometimes in the modern world where, technology or car accidents or everything else. So we'll just kind of fill some time here, and hopefully Larry will get a chance to pop in and join us. What did you know of Larry Sanger before he made his announcement about his conversion to Christianity?
Yeah, I mean, I knew he was a founder of Wikipedia, and I knew of him like tangentially. And I knew he was really big into like philosophy and stuff like that. And I read some of his stuff before. But of course, heard about his conversion from Eric Erickson, actually. And he said, hey, it's super long, but it's worth reading. And it indeed was. It both super long, but also worth reading. It took me probably a couple of sit-down times to read through it, but this is what I discovered. This wasn't something he came to lightly. Obviously, this was a long, methodical process that he had to go through, and it was very, very enlightening. And there's a couple key points I'm really interested in talking to him through it, especially like his talking about the occult and different like spiritualism, because that tends to be people's first steps out of agnosticism, is kind of this like spiritualism, and he was very forthright with he did not want to even dabble with that. And so it was. So I'm really excited about. Really excited to talk to him, kind of walk through that, because it does seem kind of interesting, So.
Yeah. And there's something atypical about a conversion after 30 some odd years to get to the point where like I'm gonna become a Christian. I mean, that's just it's not unheard of, but this is someone who comes from a world of computers and machines, philosophy, and these other things. And so I would say it's atypical to get that kind of a jump. I mean, look, you're a Christian. Do you have people in your life who are converting over in a similar fashion that you see reliably, or is this pretty surprising to you? To someone of this, he's a man of science, he's a man of coding and that kind of thing, and yet here he is now a man of faith.
Yeah, well, I appreciate it, because I'm also kind of more logical and intellectual in that pursuit, and obviously, I would liken this to kind of, well, you read this in C.S. Lewis, right? How he came to Christ and how he converted. Right. It was kind of the same process. It wasn't a road to Damascus type moment. It was a long, thought out, methodical. But you have probably one of the well-renowned, anyways, apologists for the faith in the 20th century, in C.S. Lewis, coming to kind of the same manner. So it's, I think God finds us where we need to be found. Right? So
yeah. Well, and we found Larry. There he is. Hey, Larry.
Hey.
Welcome back to the show, man. I appreciate you coming on. It's always a delight to talk to you. Yeah. Actually, so meet my buddy Nathan Martin.
Hey, how you doing?
I belong to a group of people in an email group, and it's wonderful. Always amazing people. Nathan is one of them. And your declaration about your conversion that you posted the other day, we learned about it through a man named Eric Erickson, who's also part of this group and runs a very successful radio show. And we were just discussing that, and so that kind of gets you caught up and everybody else caught up. This is Larry. There he is. Hang on, part of it there on my right shoulder. And man, I appreciate you coming back to talk about this. I put up a link to your digital Declaration of Independence, because that was from several years ago.
Yeah,
and you've been in this space of challenging, the big norms and everything, and establishing new ways to think about stuff and publishing it, and using your legitimate background to say, hey, this is the things I think or I have thought, and now I'm thinking this way. How closely tied is your digital Declaration of Independence to your conversion to Christianity?
Not very. Well, I mean,
Okay.
I suppose there's tangentially related. I mean, if I simply wanted to make a lot of money, I wouldn't have chosen my career path, or I wouldn't have been arguing the things that I argue, not nearly as much as I do. Um, and but I like to think I am sort of ruled by principle, and and I think that played itself out when I started reading the Bible. So
Yeah.
Along those lines, it's really a pleasure to meet you for the first time here. But along those lines, how. So it's been, I guess, a few days since you've written this piece, kind of just coming outwards with your conversion story.
2 weeks.
How has that been received in the intellectual community? As far as like friends and colleagues that you've had for years and years and years, how has this been kind of received by that? And is there a difference between how they're receiving it to how it's being perceived, I guess, by the layperson, for lack of a better term?
Well, last I taught philosophy was 2005. That's 20 years ago. So I really have kind of lost touch with a lot of my philosopher colleagues, to be honest. And so I haven't heard anything actually from them, except one. That's right, a guy that I hadn't heard of since like the 1990s, I think, who is a fellow graduate student, a couple of years older than me, and he shared my news. He was obviously supportive, so that was kind of nice. But for the most part, it's not news or interesting at all, if you're not a Christian, basically. Which is actually one of the reasons why I was so surprised, because I thought, well, first of all, I mean, there are a few Christians who follow me, and they're supportive, but not that many. And I didn't expect it to go viral or anything, because it's just, it's another conversion story, and not even one that most people can relate to, right? That's what I thought. I didn't realize that they would actually. So,
yeah. And if I just have a follow on, I have quite a few friends who are apologists, and one thing that in our talks that we give to parents and youth leaders and all this stuff is that you can't be afraid of the questions. And I thought it was very, very telling, at the very beginning of your piece. And you kind of echoed it through, and actually you kind of wrapped up. You started with it and you also wrapped up with it. You're just one who asks a lot of questions. Yep. And that really hits home, because I was also that kid, right? So I was son of a preacher, grandson of a preacher, great-grandson of a preacher. Okay. But I still had a lot of questions. But fortunately, I also had a dad who loved answering questions. And kind of,
sorry about that.
No, you're fine. Kind of fomented that intellectual curiosity, as in this intellectual curiosity is not incompatible with our faith. In fact, it is very much a part of it, right? I agree.
I never would have been told that, and I never thought that when I was a kid, And so it's pretty important that we try to change people's views on how they understand these things, I think.
I completely agree with that. And so, yeah, I was really excited to read your piece and kind of think about, we all kind of internalize these things based off of our experiences, right? But I was like, I was kind of thinking, it was like, wow, we were kind of the same fork in the road type speak in our teenage years. And I went one way, obviously. I've been a Christian for a long time, and you went away on the intellectual path. And it's amazing how we went those separate forks, but God always manages to kind of bring us back to where He wants us. And so I was reading it kind of from that vantage point, and it was just really, really interesting to me. But also made me, I have 12 kids of my own, and I'm thinking to myself, like, I have to be very, very careful with the words I choose. Like, I have to, oh, I don't know that's an okay answer, but I don't know is not as good as, you know what? That's a great question. Why don't we try to find the answer together?
Right.
And that really speaks to, like, because we see a lot of kids are moving away from the church. Our society is moving away from the church. And I wonder how much this lack of intellectual curiosity kind of plays into it.
I think it could play quite a bit, actually, unfortunately. It's certainly true in my experience, anyway. And if anything, kids are taught more than ever that it is right and appropriate. In fact, it's the only good way to question authority. Well, maybe not all authorities, but anyway, to question stodgy old conservative authorities for sure. And it's so. And if you're dealing with a culture in which kids, even preachers' kids, are they're exposed to that a lot, then naturally they're going to have more questions, and unfortunately or not, we older folks have to learn the answers and understand the answers, be prepared, or at least have our fingers on good resources that we can use to essentially defend doctrine. Because if we're not able to do that, then that the kids who are listening closely to us will get a message that we might not want them to get.
I'm curious, Larry, you being a philosopher in training and having taught it, there's so much philosophy in the Bible and or adjacent to it, Augustine's work, or Paul is obviously a philosopher that talks about love, but there's also, all of the reformists, Knox and Luther and all them dudes. So what are your thoughts in general on how you see, while you have your philosopher's hat on, how do you see these various philosophies?
How do I see the various philosophies about what?
Well, just, the different works that come out of the ways that, Paul talks about love almost nonstop, right? And there's quite a bit of that in there. And so there's all these different things that they're going into in terms of philosophy.
Would it address your question if I were to explain why I think the Bible is in fact very philosophical?
Sure.
Yeah. So I'm working on a book called God Exists, and it basically is an attempt to explain the reasons that I came to, but not just explain those reasons, but also to develop them in a sort of systematic way. And one of the last arguments that I make is something I call the argument from consistency, which is part of the argument from revelation. You can't really defend the Christian faith if you don't argue that the Bible is reliable in some sense. So part of the argument then is that the God that is described by the Bible is in very great fine-grained detail the same as the God described by natural theology or philosophy of religion. In other words, if you line up all of the familiar arguments for the existence of God, and you look for support for all of the premises of those arguments in the Bible, you can find it in spades. It's really, in some cases, it's quite amazing how what a precise fit there is. So I actually write 2 chapters, probably 100 pages, about this very topic. And it's amazing to me just how much light was shed on the traditional arguments for the existence of God. I never would have guessed this when I was reading the Bible, even the Old Testament. There's philosophical parts, and then the whole thing is just full of thoughts that, if you really try to come to grips with them, they are very closely adjacent, because it's theology in that case. If you're trying to come to grips with the thoughts behind the Bible, right? That's adjacent to philosophy. And of course, anything that has to do with morality is closely related to ethics. Without getting into the details, I think I agree. I think that the branch of philosophy that is most explicitly addressed in the Bible would be philosophy of religion, or what's called natural theology, and ethics. So a little bit of metaphysics, perhaps. Yep.
So I've always been, it's always been kind of fascinating to me to see how different sects of Christianity address the mind, and the ability of the mind. Like, we all understand kind of loosely how we're kind of this mind, body, soul. But it seems like I come from a Pentecostal tradition, right? So very emotive, right? Very much feeling, and we're really good at that. But sometimes we weren't the best at the mind stuff, right? But then you got the high church, right, where you have Catholicism and Episcopalians, and etc. And they're very good at the kind of the mind thinking part of it,
right? Not
so great at it. So for you in your journey, obviously you really focused on the mind, and we understand that. But how is the incorporation of those other pieces have you seen fit since your conversion as well, with kind of the overall you aspect?
I'm not quite sure I understand the question. Like, how have I been changed? Is that the question, or is?
Yeah. So, like, obviously you're very intellectual. That's where you were. That's where your kind of natural place is, right?
Yep.
But kind of the emotive stuff. Like, how did that kind of play into your conversion as well?
Well, you can't really be converted unless you have a relationship to God, and a proper relationship involves basically putting your loyalties with the Father, Son, and Holy Ghost, so of course, there came a time when I had to say, oh, this sort of play pretend talking to God thing is actually real. I'm not saying that I heard the voice of God in my head or anything, but I'm saying that I actually am really praying to God. And has become very important. I feel like I have missed a lot if I haven't said one or two or more long substantive prayers to God, essentially talking to God and imagining how he would respond to me. And I don't know how emotional that is. That's not really the question, is it? It's the question is whether it concerns myself, and whether it concerns the actual problems that I'm facing, and so forth. Yeah, I think about that stuff a lot. I'm engaged in application of the Bible to my life a great deal, I would say, in my prayer life especially. So I could go on, I suppose, but I think that answers the question.
I appreciate it. Thank you.
I do try. I have a discipline of trying to pray 7 times a day. Once when I wake up, once before I go to sleep, and then in the morning, early afternoon, late afternoon, early evening, late evening. And I don't always hit it, and like sending myself reminders doesn't really help, but I usually do quite a few. I think it's, Paul said, pray without ceasing. That just has stuck in my mind. And so that's really what I try to do. I feel like if I feel that I am estranged from God, that's like the worst thing possible. And of course the solution is to repent of your sins. That's the only way to restore a proper relationship. So
there's so much to learn when it comes to religion. You converted well into your adulthood. There's the story of Jonah, Job, there's exegesis, all these different things that you can put into your head. Do you feel like you're behind in terms of your command of the Bible? What's in there? Will you go to the Greek and Hebrew roots and look at some of that? Because when you start to read it in the original tongue, all of a sudden these things start to change as well. I mean, it's an amazing thing. What are your thoughts on how you guide your education?
How I do what?
Yeah, like what are your thoughts on how you're going to guide your education to increase your knowledge of the book and the practice?
Well, I have read the Bible 5 times now. I'm closing in on the 5th read through. I never stopped reading after I started it. I probably have missed a day or two, but not very many. So that's the first thing. That's very important. And then within the first couple of weeks of reading the Bible, I was already consulting like a study Bible, the ESV study Bible. And then I started, when it didn't have an answer to a question, I would look up commentaries in BibleHub.com, which is awesome. I mean, it's got this massive trove of free commentaries, mostly, like from the 18th and 19th century, but really good stuff, like Darby and Gill and so and so I enjoy that. I enjoy the process of answering my questions about the Bible. The first time through was quite a struggle. It was not only was I trying to answer all the questions that I had, but I was trying to do it in 100 days all the way through the Bible. So it actually took a lot of time out. At the time, I was sort of between projects. So I had a little time, but nevertheless, yeah, it was and it was sort of emotionally um, challenging, right? Because it required that I change my point of view about some things if I were going to take the text seriously. And it's not that I decided I was going to do that in advance. It's just I found myself doing that. Um, and but now I've got several things going. So I've got a like at the beginning of April, my Bible study group will be finishing the a 2-year plan to read both testaments, the New Testament twice in that time, and also either watch or read introductions to the books. And those who could were supposed to do reading in study Bibles or commentaries or whatever. And I actually chose the ESV Study Bible, which I had used, several times before, but this time I actually read the whole thing, almost. I think there were a few times when I just couldn't keep up with the reading and doing that and everything else I had to do. But like 90% of it ish. It's a lot. It's a lot. And I read the Bible first this time around. It'll change next time. But first I read the NIV, then I read the KJV. That's a nice little combination, really. The NIV sort of gets you a notion of what the text is saying. And then, by sort of reminding me of what it says, that makes it easier to read the KJV without looking things up as much as I normally would have to. But I feel like I'm much closer to the text because it's so literal. The KJV is, and that it's anyway. What else? In my Bible study thing, I make a point of posting. Well, not every day, but I'd say every other day or so, some substantive comments, often more than one, about something. Just whatever caught my eye, I'll talk about it, and then in addition to all that, whenever I'm out on my way to to a park to take a walk and back and some other things, I'm listening to theology, and you can listen to a lot of theology riding in the car. So, like right now, I am listening to a couple of different books. I'm listening to "The City of God" by Augustine, of course, and also well. There isn't an audio book version, but what I do is I just have it read to me. It just you can, if you set up your iPhone to do it, you can just take two fingers at the top of the screen and drag down, and it will read all the text on the page or in the document that is open. So I do that, and it automatically goes through pages. So it's almost like an audio book. I've been doing that with historical theology, is what it's called. I've read a few different, gone through one course of lectures about theology, and I've read all of John Frame's theology. and I've read a number of books about theological topics, quite a few actually. But most of my time actually is spent like going through all that. Yes, it's Greg Allison is his name, the author of the Historical Theology, which I guess is probably a seminary text. It seems to be written that way, but it's really good. And I, yes, I'm learning quite a bit from it. A lot of times, frankly, I still have questions about this and that, and I will just ask ChatGPT for and I tell it in advance in the sort of instructions to the model, you know, what your preferences are. Essentially, it'll let you do this. So I say, you know, always quote the KJV at me, and always, you know, I come from a sort of Arminian Protestant point of view, but also one that is interested in philosophy and theology, and so forth. And it just like adapts to my proclivities very nicely. And I learned a lot by, you know, asking it questions and debating with it even more. And okay, and then another thing I'm doing is half an hour every day, 5 days a week. Anyway, that's the minimum. I work on the book that I mentioned before, God Exists. So that's how. And I've been very good at for the last 2.5, 3 years or so. Like the first couple of years, I went through phases, but now I actually have adopted an explicit discipline, and nothing except the, you know, knowledge that God wants me to do this would actually keep me so consistently on the track to do this. I never would have been able to do this before. I just wouldn't have had the self-discipline, to be perfectly honest. But now I do, at least for this project. And so it's getting up to 550, 600 pages, third draft, written and rewritten, things shuffled around a lot. I'm in the process of doing that. I always share the things that I write as part of my process with ChatGPT to just like get feedback. It's pretty good at that, actually. A lot of the sort of feedback that it gives me is kind of, I don't know, it feels like it's boilerplate. It's not that helpful, except when it is, because sometimes it is quite helpful. Especially when I'm writing about something that I don't know so much about. But I have probably done enough reading and study in the last 5 years to put me on a par with somebody with an MDiv. That's what I figure. So, but I don't know. Maybe not. But I'm continuing.
It's got to be approaching it, right? Like that many years of
close.
studying it. Yeah, I mean, you know, that's pretty good. And it's got to be pretty close, because there's only so much work you do for an MDiv, you know, of any kind of sort. And then the other thing is, I wanted to ask, who's guiding this? Is it self-guided, or do you have someone that you ask your questions from?
It's not totally self-guided, no. But frankly, it's mostly self-guided, because nobody's going to take all the time that I would ask them, I think, not without being paid, because it would be a lot of work. Yeah, no, I've talked. I get book recommendations from Michael Spiegel, the chair of the theology department at Dallas Theological Seminary. He's read my book. He said very nice things about it. Won't go into that. And also, I've talked quite a bit with well, when I first started talking to him, he was an elder in one of the branches of Orthodoxy, and now he's a priest. But he's about my age. I enjoy talking to him. I don't necessarily agree about all theological matters, but he's very nice, and he's very open and tolerant and interesting. So he's given me feedback on the book as well, and we talked about a few things. Let's see, and then in the first year, there was somebody who had been converted just a couple of years before that, and he also gave me a lot of advice. But he was a fellow PhD philosopher, so I appreciated him and his help. Oh, and then there was a guy when I actually started trying to go through a systematic program of theological study. I wrote it all out. I still have the plan. Never actually finished the plan. It's changed since then, but whatever. I ran it by a guy who is an adjunct professor. I forget where, but he has a website online, which is basically a bibliography of Bible studies and theology. And I think I reached out to him with some questions, and then we got discussing, and he helped a lot, but we kind of lost touch there. But I appreciate his help a lot. He really did. We talked on the phone a few times. He gave me a lot of book recommendations and so forth, and I followed them. Well, there's one other thing that I did. I actually wrote over 500 pages of study notes about Genesis. That took me like 3 years. That lasted from like two.
That's a MDiv by itself.
Yeah,
yeah. I'll say.
Yeah, that's 2021 to early 2023 or so. I wasn't reading the Bible as closely, except for Genesis at that time, but I was still trying to read it. But he gave me a lot of advice about like books about biblical archaeology, which is just fascinating. It's like one of the most interesting things you can study if you're interested in the Bible at all. And so I read some ancillary texts, and from near the ancient Near East, basically trying to answer questions about whether it matters, how to solve issues of or challenges based on the similarity of the story of Noah to like the Atrahasis and parts of even not Beowulf, sorry, the other ancient epic. It's on the tip of my tongue. Anyway, what's that?
Odyssey?
No.
Oh,
Tristan and Isolde?
Gilgamesh. The epic of Gilgamesh. Yes. Right. Anyway, yes. So a little tired. I've been you interviewers have kept me very busy over the last week.
You keep yourself busy, man. Have you seen all the stuff that you do? Everybody check out the Sanger feed of your project with encyclopedias and tracking things. Like there's all the different pages. I'll put some links up there for anybody interested in what Larry does if you don't already know Larry's work. Larry keeps himself busy in addition to being great.
I do.
I was about to say he just threw in that he casually wrote a 500 page on Genesis, just in his spare time over 3 years.
Right. Yeah.
Well, I actually thought that I was going to like continue studying the Bible in that way. And I actually tried to start Matthew, but it was getting so long that I didn't even quite finish Matthew chapter 3. but I've got about 100 pages about Matthew 1 and 2 and half of 3 though. So
Just throw that in there.
How does music interact with your faith? I mean, for me, it's a big part of what I think about how I was raised. My dad had he had a master's in divinity, but he also had an undergrad in sacred music, and so it's just a big part of it. And there's something about the human experience and resonating in sounds and choirs and stuff that just it works for people.
I'm shockingly inexperienced at that, and I need to get myself to church. I know, and as a result, I probably know the hymns better from my childhood than I do from the half a dozen times I've been to church in the last 5 years.
Mm-hmm.
So we can talk about that if you like, but yeah, I couldn't sing any hymns. I'll swing Low Sweet Chariot maybe. Yeah.
Yeah, but like when I think about is there a God, and I question, what I believe and everything, I think about Silent Night. This comes downloads from God. I think about Frank Stallone, who said, God sent me the gift of being able to play music in one download, right? And you can say, bullshit. But there's Frank Stallone saying, no, I didn't know how to play anything. And then the next day I had this musical ability, and he can sing, dance, play. He is hyper talented, right? And this comes from somewhere. When you walk upon the Duomo in Milan, you're like, whoa, like there's evidence of God right there, because you don't build something like that if you're not inspired by something big and pure.
Yeah, my fiddle playing hasn't really gotten better since I converted.
In addition to the things that you do, I'll put a link up for your YouTube page.
That wasn't really a work of grace. I mean, my fiddle playing is a very nice hobby, which I don't have a lot of time for, but which I do, every so often I'll pick it up and keep the abilities not too rusty. But obviously, Irish traditional music is not exactly sacred music. So there is a tune called "The Man Who Died and Rose Again," for what it's worth. There's Christmas Eve, Real. They don't really feel any more holy than the other tunes, to be quite honest. Mm-hmm. But I thank God for the ability to make my own music. So
yeah. So I wanted to touch on one part of your piece on your conversion, and you talked about how you kind of briefly, for lack of a better term, researched kind of the occult, or what you call like occultic things. Right. And you talk about how you were aware enough that you wanted to make sure that door stayed firmly shut.
Right.
And it really resonated with me because, man, the things that my kids' friends talk about and everything like that, it is as if they are just wanting to run through that door.
Right.
What word of caution would you give to parents or people who are listening to this about keeping, like, why you felt the need to keep that door firmly shut, and maybe what we can garner from you of keeping that door firmly shut, dealing with kind of this spiritualism? Because I was talking before you jumped on, it does seem like the natural progression seems to be for agnostics go from agnosticism to kind of the spiritualism before Christianity. And it really seems like you never really did that bridge. You went like, hey, I'm going to go dig into the Bible. And
no, there was a short bridge. There was a short bridge there. It wasn't spiritualism. It was deism.
Okay.
Yeah, no, there was a point where I said, yeah, I see the reasonableness of the idea of a designer of the universe. um, but to explain, well, no, to accept everything else that the Bible says about God would require that I buy into the Bible, and I hadn't even finished reading it. So and I knew so little about theology at that time. So just the sorts of things that a teacher, a non-Christian teacher of the philosophy of religion would know, which is not much, frankly, in my case anyway. So I can only tell you how I think about approaching the occult, and my view, I guess, was formulated even before my conversion, but it's become more refined. So I'll give you my present view, which is simply that what the occult is the successor practices and beliefs of ancient polytheism, and especially the mystery religions. Now, a lot of the stuff that like the New Agers believe is just, revivalism. They got their hands on some medieval manuscripts or whatever, and they started studying them and the rest of that. But even that stuff is continuous with ancient traditions, I think. And a good way then to think about what's going on when you're dealing with the occult, I guess, is that you are dealing with attempts to contact, make use of, interact with, benefit from the spirit world independently of God, and in ways that are defined essentially by, as it happens, groups that were formed in reaction to the Bible to a great extent. So a lot of like modern occultism makes use of biblical language, biblical symbols. The Rosicrucians, the rosy cross, the red cross, and there's all kinds of temple symbology in Freemasonry, for example. So the point is that the occult is a perversion of Orthodox Christian belief. And one thing that we're told about the Satan, and I think this comes from especially people who have studied the occult and just noticed this about what they do and then associated it with Satan, because it's a little harder. It isn't entirely impossible to find this in the Bible, but you can. The point is that Satan, he inverts, twists true and proper doctrine. He tries to make himself into an angel of light. That's one thing you can find in the Bible. He tried to make himself equal to God, or at least if you think the certain passages from, I guess, Isaiah and Ezekiel are representative of
Right.
yeah. So anyway, the important thing in my view is that we basically wash our hands entirely of it, stay away from it, because what they say is, and I'm talking about the occultists, the modern occultists today, they say that, and I think this is also an ancient idea, that it is knowledge of hidden truths, That's why it's called the occult, because the occult means hidden. It is knowledge of hidden truths that actually brings a certain kind of enlightenment. They like to talk about light. They like to talk about enlightenment. Now there's a false light, and the idea is that even if you're studying about the occult, I realized this fairly early on, because I was trained as a scholar of difficult texts, basically, and one thing that I immediately recognized when I started reading books about the occult is that there really is not that much difference between what you're reading when you read a book about the occult and when you read one of the books of the occult, one of their textbooks or whatever. You're going to learn a lot of that stuff. Well, I don't want to learn that stuff, especially if it like opens spiritual doorways as they say it does. So I'll take them at their word as far as that goes, I guess. So yeah, that's why I still like have hands off. There's one video maker whose work I appreciate, Spencer Smith. Now I don't agree with him about everything, and he's very funny. Well, Nathan, you actually look a little bit like a little older version of Spencer. And he's, what am I going to say here? He wrote he made a very interesting 4-part, maybe it's 5 parts now for all I know, series, which he called Third Adam, I think. And because first there was the first Adam, then the second Adam would be Jesus. The third Adam would be, well, Satan, because he's trying to make himself into a better Jesus or something. And at least I think that's why he calls it that. At any rate, it's an exploration of how different branches of our society perverts Christian doctrine through being influenced by the occult. That's the general theme, and which is very interesting. But I watched like 15, 20, 30 minutes of it, and I said, I can't watch this anymore.
Right.
Because it's too much. And so maybe it's okay for Spencer. He's been a Christian for a long time. But I wouldn't want to do it. That's for sure. I wouldn't want to study that stuff.
Well, I think that there's wisdom in kind of keeping those doors shut. Like there's a fine line between having to understand the dangers, and then, experiencing the dangers yourself. Right. And there's, I know electricity can be dangerous. I don't need to stick a fork in the electric socket to experience it, to realize it. Right. I also don't need to experience it like that to tell my kids it's dangerous. So I think there's some wisdom there, and you're absolutely right. Like, that's the very first lie, right? Well, did God really say, did God really say that? Did God really say that if you touch this, and God never said that, right? But, and so then they touch it. They're like, okay, nothing happened. Oh, okay. So now I can eat it. It's just how that happens perpetually throughout history. And of course it keeps on happening, right? We experience this in our own lives when we sin, right? It's always that, most of us don't go out and do these really big, bad, bold sins off the rip, right? We're not going big about going home, but what we do is it's that slow slide into mediocrity, right? And I think that when I originally read about keeping that door shut, what I remembered is the screw tape letters, when he says, we can either do one or two things. We can either make them say that we don't exist, or we can have them have an unhealthy belief in us, right? Or
Mhm.
unhealthy fascination, I think is what C.S. Lewis says.
Mhm, mhm.
And so it's two sides of the coin, and we do have to be careful with that.
It's interesting that you should mention C.S. Lewis in that regard, because I happen to know that C.S. Lewis himself was highly interested in the occult when he was like a teenager and a young man. And that comes out in his books. His books are full of occult symbolism, especially the space trilogy, I think. Like I decided not to read the third book basically because it was so, let's just say, pronounced. Um, so that's an example of something where I'm a little fastidious about such things. The third book meaning, what is it called? This hideous strength, I think. I think that's what it's called. Anyway, it's the third book in that series. But I don't mean to badmouth C.S. Lewis. I think he's got a lot of good things to teach, and I recommend that people read Mere Christianity, for example. But it is interesting, isn't it? Wonder if if he was a Freemason. I doubt it. But I wouldn't assume. So
yeah. Well, I don't want to take too much of your time. You've been already great. I know that you've got
Absolutely.
other things to get to because you are a busy dude. One of the coolest things you have is that thumb drive with 60 or almost 70,000 books from the Gutenberg Project
yeah.
that folks can get to. So definitely, I mean, look, just go check out what Larry is doing, and you will see a treasure trove of things, whether it's on the Sanger feed or on his website. And you guys have seen those links pop up here and there. So for me, I won't ask any more questions about this on this episode. I appreciate you, but I'm going to let Nathan wrap up whatever he's got to say, and then I'll give the floor to you, and we can do this again when you're ready to talk about something else. So for me, thank you. Yeah. Nathan, go ahead and help us wrap up what you want to wrap up, and then we'll close out with Larry.
Yeah, so I just wanted to talk really quick about because kind of how you ended up, like trying to find a church. And I love how you said, like, I know I need to do this. I know that this is expected, because a lot of people, I think, would take the out of be like, I don't know if it's necessarily required. Or I love how you just come out and say, yeah, I know it's required. I know I need to do it. Where are you at in kind of that journey? And then, I know you already know this, but my edification in that would be to you is like, man, think about that 10-year-old kid who would be going to your church, asking those questions, and how you might be able to help them answer them. Because I know one of your reasonings was like, well, I still ask a lot of questions. Yeah. And my thought was like, man, but there's like in some church in your community, there's that 10-year-old, 12-year-old kid who's asking those questions. Who needs to have you sit down with him and answer some of those. That would be my edification. But like, where are you in that journey?
You're right. I know that, and I'm sure that there are important things that I have to learn from a church, hymns, for example. First I have to explain my situation is different. It's not unique, but it's pretty close to it. It isn't just that I'm like a philosopher and I'm going to raise a lot of questions. There's some of that. So like any philosopher who like converts and starts asking questions could very easily make a nuisance of himself in like Bible study class or whatever, adult Sunday school, whatever. But my issue is that I know that, well, just look at how people have reacted to my testimony. I didn't think it was going to be this bad. Well, or good, actually, but nevertheless, that it was going to be this pronounced, right? Well, then I guess something similar would happen if I were to come to a church. And then what if I feel obligated to leave the church after, after 6 months, and the pastor has been, telling people that, the co-founder of Wikipedia goes to my church and so forth. And but then he decided that our denomination is not actually for him. I don't want to do that to those people. That would be very bad. And even something like that might actually cause division within that congregation. So I won't allow myself to do that. In the meantime, I've got my Bible study group, which has actually got a number of pastors in it now, which I'm blessed. Is the case. I'm very happy. But I know it's not church, of course. That's face to face. Now, I have been working systematically, maybe a little too slowly, through some of the questions that the denominations divide over. So a few months ago, I wrote a long blog post about in defense of sola scriptura. Disappointed that nobody has actually argued with me about that. But it's long and meaty, philosophical, theological, biblical. And I've also done the same with regard to the Eucharist or the Lord's Supper. So I have actually made 3 different videos. One of them is over an hour long. Yes, well over an hour long, about the Eucharist, whether the question whether the communion wafers and wine are really the body and blood of Christ, or symbolically represent what his body and blood represented. So I've sort of worked out fairly firm answers. I'm not saying I've totally 100% necessarily made up my mind even about those things, but I'm pretty sure I know what I think about those things. But then I've got other things that I want to get to soon. I'm working through one now about basic soteriology. What is it in virtue of which we are saved? What saves us ultimately? What does it mean to be saved? I'm actually going through a lot of Bible texts and doing pure biblical theology. Well, it's not biblical theology, what they call biblical. It's pure theology. But heavy use of the Bible and other things. So my most recent blog post, I actually ask for help reducing all of the differences between the denominations to a set of questions, such that if I answered all of the questions very well, then I would know precisely what my denominational home should be. That's the idea. So you've seen these "what denomination am I" quizzes. So it's like a more serious attempt to get very clear about like sort of the minimum set of questions necessary. And it's about 15, 20, I think. I was thinking, I don't know if I will do this, maybe not, but I was thinking of like just going through all of the questions and like beginning with one paragraph answers and then expanding the answers or something like that. I don't know. But I know what I think about, what I am inclined to think about almost all of those questions, if not all of them. It's just that it's one thing to lean in a certain direction. It's another to be familiar enough with Scripture and with the relevant, attempts to persuade theological positions that might persuade me or change my mind in the future. I need to make myself better acquainted with all of that. I mean, right now, like I'm saying, I've been going through this history, this historical theology book. It helps a lot, but I wish somebody would write a book that actually answered all my questions, or rather that gave a catalog of different positions on the questions, but and treated them in a really serious theological way. But I don't think such a book exists. I've asked.
Yeah, probably
Yeah.
not. I will say, as a Pentecostal who goes to a Baptist church, so my prayer for you is just that you end up where God wants you to be. I think that's the most important thing. When it comes to doctrine, you have your primary doctrines, your secondary doctrines, your tertiary doctrines, and I wouldn't
Right.
sweat the tertiary stuff, barely sweat the secondary stuff. But as long as you're good in the primary stuff, the bottom line is where God wants you to be, and then bloom where you're planted in that community. And that's my prayer for you, is that you find that community, and don't, I wouldn't sweat so much about the secondary and tertiary as I would, does God want me here, and can I help this community grow? And I think that's kind of what we're all called to do when we find our church body. So that's my prayer for you, my
Thank you.
exhortation to you, as it were. And you definitely are in my thoughts and prayers. My group of people that I deal with, you're in our thoughts and prayers. And however, Pete can give you my information. However you have questions or feel that I can add value, I'm willing to do so, and I'm willing to pray for you and come alongside you in this journey, and excited that you are a part of the family.
Thank you, Nathan. I appreciate it.
All right, I'm going to wrap this thing up. Everybody else, I'll see you tomorrow. Fellas, I'll be back to you guys in a second to say goodbye in a proper way. Everybody else, see you tomorrow.